In this lecture, we'll be examining the history of the Tang Dynasty from the 7th century to 10th century CE. The Tang Dynasty is often referred to as the golden age of Chinese culture due to the many innovations that occurred in a wide range of fields, as we will see. During this time, the Chinese made a change to a modern civil service system with standard examinations for government employees. There were a great deal of technological advances that occurred in this time period, such as woodblock printing, gear-driven clocks, hydraulic pumps, and we'll talk about some of those in a few slides. The Tang Dynasty is also known for its modernization and standardization of the imperial legal code. Quite a few technological innovations. We're just going to touch on a few of them in the Tang Dynasty. While gunpowder had existed in China at least several centuries earlier, it was during the Tang Dynasty that military uses of gunpowder emerged. Military engineers developed explosive bombs with gunpowder that could be launched from catapults to deadly effect. The image on the left is a modern sketch of a Tang-era four-legged catapult. Other varieties of the Chinese catapult, which was known as the Xuanfeng, Xuanfeng, were wheeled, and some versions were permanently countersunk into the ground. Some of these Tang-era catapults required as many as 100 men to operate. During the Tang Dynasty, inventors created a method of magnetizing iron needles by coating them with the iron oxide known as magnetite, then suspending the needles in water, thus developing the world's first practical compass. They also developed nautical versions that could be put on ships. Water wheels were developed for a number of innovations during the Tang Dynasty. Water-powered fan wheels found use as air conditioning devices in the 8th century CE. There's a number of texts that discuss how this form of air conditioning was used in imperial palaces and government buildings. They were also put to use as sources of power for pressured water fountains. Advances in woodblock printing helped make available a greater number of printed materials during the Tang Dynasty, and this is also tied to an increase in literacy rates. During the Tang Dynasty, literacy rates appear to be higher in China than anywhere else in the world at that time. In woodblock printing, text is first printed on a thin piece of paper, then pasted onto a wooden plate. Characters are then engraved in the wood to create a wood block printing plate from which a document could be produced. The image on the right in this slide gives you examples of woodblock Chinese characters for a movable type press. Beginning in the Tang Dynasty, the primary subject matter of Chinese painting was the landscape. This was known as the shanshui type of painting, which means mountain water. This style of painting typically depicts scenery or natural landscapes. Shanshui artists, and that's S-H-A-N-S-H-U-I if you're interested in spelling, used brushes and ink rather than more conventional paints. In these landscapes, which were usually monochromatic, as you can see here, and rather sparse, the purpose was not to reproduce exactly the appearance of nature, but rather to grasp an emotion or an atmosphere so as to catch the rhythm of nature. And I find some interesting parallels between this type of painting and European Impressionism. To me, they seem to share some similar, at least philosophical traits. In this image, we have an 8th century CE painting. It's not an example of the landscape style or the shanshui style we talked about in the previous slide. It's nonetheless quite impressive. The title of this work is Night Shining White, and it's attributed to the artist Han Gan, H-A-N-G-A-N. The format used here is a hand scroll with ink on paper. In this next image, we have an example of Tang-era metalworking. The Chinese during the Tang Dynasty also developed advanced metalworking industries that far outpaced other civilizations at the time. This image is of a dish in the shape of a leaf from the late 7th to early 8th century CE. The metal used in this decorative dish is silver, and this work of art is also noteworthy for a technique known as parcel gilding, which involves putting a thin layer of gold in select areas of the object. Now this is somewhat dated, but you can still see some of the gold, the thin layer of gold or gilding on the what appears to be fruit and objects that are raised up and around the edges of the decorative dish. The Tang Dynasty was interrupted briefly by the assumption or rise to the throne of the only woman to assume the imperial throne in Chinese history, to be Empress. Wu Zetian had a 15-year reign. Now some scholars call this a separate sort of mini dynasty. Others see this as just sort of a blip or an aberration. Wu Zetian has a very complex historical reputation. She was a concubine of the previous emperor, and through rather devious methods achieved power. She maintained power through the use of a secret police and assassinations of rivals and enemies. She apparently even deposed her own son to get to the throne. But we have to take this with a grain of salt, because Wu Zetian represented something very threatening to Confucian Chinese society, which is a woman who was not, so to speak, in her place at that time. Remember from our earlier discussions of Confucianism, women were expected to be subservient, so she did not fit that mold, and thus we have to be a little skeptical of sources that later tried to put her in unflattering terms. I think modern scholarship has tempered the condemnations that many traditional Chinese scholars have had about Wu Zetian. The Tang era is noted for one of the greatest of Chinese poets, Li Bai. His family history is kind of murky. We don't know too much about his early years. We do accept that a number of sources discuss his talent first at the martial arts. Some sources also claim that Li Bai killed several rivals. So maybe Chuck Norris with a more sensitive side. Definitely influenced by Taoism, so there's this mystical quality to his work. Also influenced to a great deal by alcohol, and I don't mean this in a disrespectful way. He was a big drinker of sorts. According to legend, he died while he was very drunk, trying to embrace the moon, and fell into a body of water and drowned. Drinking Alone Under the Moon is a poem by Li Bai. I'm going to read it briefly and give you a sense of his poetry. To me, Li Bai almost reminds me of a modern rock star like Jim Morrison. That's probably too old of a pop culture reference for most of you, but here we go. Among the flowers, a single jug of wine. I drink alone. No one close to me. I raise my cup, invite the bright moon. Facing my shadow, together we make three. The moon doesn't know how to drink, and my shadow can only follow my body. But for a time I make moon and shadow my companions. Taking one's pleasure must last until spring. I sing. The moon wavers back and forth. I dance. My shadow flickers and scatters. When I'm sober, we take pleasure together. When I'm drunk, we each go our own ways. I make an oath to journey forever, free of feelings, making an appointment with them to meet in the Milky Way afar. As discussed earlier in this presentation, the Tang Dynasty is noted for significant advancements in agriculture. These innovations led to a rapid growth in agricultural production, which in turn helped fuel considerable population growth in the Tang era. Between the 7th and 9th centuries CE, the population of Imperial China grew from about 50 million people to over 80 million people, which is approximately a 60% increase. Chinese military incursions into the region that we today call Vietnam brought back with them a new variety of rice. The so-called fast-ripening rice allowed for the planting and harvesting of 2 rice crops per year instead of 1. When this particular variety was introduced to the very fertile fields of southern China, fast-ripening rice quickly expanded food supplies. Population growth between 600 and 1200 CE in China was from 45 to 115 million people. A number of new agricultural techniques and inventions emerged during the Tang Dynasty, and these innovations helped spur the early growth in agricultural productivity during the Tang. Heavy iron plows allowed for faster plowing of fields and the digging of troughs of consistent depth. Tang-era agriculturalists harnessed oxen and water buffaloes to assist in planting and plowing. They learned to enrich soil with manure and composted organic matter to replenish the soil faster. Extensive irrigation systems were developed in some of the drier regions to increase yields and the total amount of arable land. This artificial irrigation greatly increased agricultural production, which again assisted in the rapid population expansion. Increased food supplies encouraged also the growth of large cities. During the Tang Dynasty, Chang'an, which you can see pictured on the map, at least where it was, it's no longer called that, was the world's most populous city at that time. At least 1 million people and perhaps as many as 2 million residents lived in and around the vicinity of Chang'an. This city was also the southern terminus for a time of the Grand Canal, so it was located in a prime position to tap into that network of waterways. Pictured also on this slide is the giant wild goose pagoda, which was built in Chang'an in 652 during the Tang Dynasty. Initially, the pagoda was 5 stories in height. The building was reconstructed in 704 during the reign of Empress Wu Zetian. It did get a facelift later, I think in the 14th century, but interestingly, the pagoda has withstood quite a few earthquakes and other natural disasters, and it is an extremely old building that's in remarkably good shape. This map shows the territorial growth that occurred during the Tang Dynasty. Note here that the region of Manchuria, which is in sort of a, depending on your browser, sort of a dark tan or burnt orange color, had now become a tributary state of the Chinese Empire. In the 9th century CE, the imperial revenue base of the Tang Dynasty began to erode for a number of reasons. Part of this was due to imperial land grants to notables or aristocrats who did their best to avoid taxes. In addition, new regional challenges to the central authorities arose in the form of the Jiedushi, that's Jiedushi, who were regional military governors originally given extensive powers to allow them to quickly respond to external threats. However, the Jiedushi themselves grew very powerful and began to challenge the authority of the emperor. Also in the 9th century CE, the population grew more quickly than land and money could provide. This led to famines and significant increases in the price of food throughout China. In the second half of the 9th century CE, the number of peasant rebellions began to rise, in no small part due to food shortages and a lack of response by the central government to some natural disasters. Some of these rebellions also merged with discontent among aristocrats. The most significant of the major rebellions was the Huangchao Rebellion, which lasted from 874 to 884 CE. Though the Tang government eventually defeated the rebels, the central government was severely weakened by the lengthy conflict in the Huang Chao Rebellion. That's Huangchao. This rebellion eventually caused, in part, the collapse of the Tang Dynasty. The Tang were also attacked by groups from the north, who took control of regions including southern Manchuria. And unfortunately for the Tang, despite the fact that it had been known as the golden age of Chinese civilization, the end of the dynasty was not so pretty, and it ended in chaos and civil war. This brings to a close our brief overview of the Tang Dynasty.